Corruption in the media in India is as old as the media or corruption itself. But in recent years, it has acquired a pernicious dimension because it threatens to undermine democracy itself in the world's largest democracy. I was a member of the Press Council of India and a member of a subcommittee that was appointed by the Press Council to look into allegations that newspapers were masquerading advertisements as news items in the run up to elections, thereby committing a series of frauds. At one level, the person who would be reading that particular newspaper, or for that matter, somebody who's looking at a particular television program, she or he is deceived into believing that what is supposed to be independently produced, objective, unbiased news is actually being paid for by somebody. So you're blurring the dividing line between advertising and news. But that's not all. There's a second set of fraudulent activities involved in these transactions, which are clandestine. The bribe giver and the bribe taker are both involved. The candidate who's standing for elections, if she or he fails to disclose the expenditure that that person is incurring, then you are violating the laws of the land. You're violating the conduct of election rules, which is under the Representation of People Act. And in this case, say, not just the bribe givers, the candidates, but the bribe takers could be representatives of the media organizations, or it could be individuals. Either way, they do not disclose where their income is coming from, they're violating the Income Tax Act or the provisions of the Companies Act. What happens is that in the run-up to the election, candidates want to reach out to their constituents, their potential voters, and they pay money to these newspapers to publish favorable articles about them. And what's equally interesting is that they pay money so that the same newspapers can criticize or trash their political opponents. This unfortunate trend was noticed. It has been around for donkey's years, but it kind of became a big phenomenon in the run-up to the 2009 general elections in India, and thereafter in certain provincial or state assembly elections. You had an unusual phenomenon where some of the biggest and the best known newspapers, they were indulging in this kind of malpractice. So this gave corruption in the media a new dimension. It went way beyond, bribing an individual journalist to write a favorable article. It went beyond, newspapers accepting shares from a particular company which advertises in lieu of advertising space. By affecting the democratic process, this kind of political news was particularly pernicious. And it was not just a stray phenomenon, individual phenomenon. It was well organized. The corruption was part of an organization, part of a corporate structure. And the biggest known names, the most widely circulated newspapers. When we started investigating people, we give the people against whom allegations were being leveled the right to reply. There were representatives of Dainik Jagran, which is one of India's most widely circulated newspapers. And why India is one of the world's most widely circulated daily newspapers. It's a Hindi publication. It comes out from well over 24, over 30 centers all over North India. If you look at the website of the World Association of Newspapers, it's among the it's among the most widely circulated newspapers. There were newspapers like Lokmat, which is third or the fourth most widely circulated Marathi language newspaper. There was Inadu, which is the most widely circulated Telugu language newspaper, the Punjab Kesari, even the Times of India. There was one example of, even in the case of the Times of India and one of their supplements, writing an article which seemed laudatory to the son of the former president of India. And though it was in a supplement, when P. Sainath, the rural affairs editor of the Hindu, brought it out, nobody denied it. The press council wrote to all these companies asking them for their responses. Take the case of Hindustan. In the case of Hindustan, the management of the company did acknowledge that what happened should not have happened. On the day elections were to take place, there was an article saying there was a wave in favor of the Congress party. The following day, after everybody had voted, the same newspaper said that no, actually this appeared to be a news item, but it was not a news item. It was a sponsored feature. The marketing department had done it, by which time it was too late. And they said an overzealous advertising manager was responsible. Now, what has happened in India is that there is now greater awareness of what's been happening. And the Election Commission of India, the Press Council of India, and various other bodies have become aware of the widespread practice. I want to highlight 2 or 3 cases, and you'll find all the details in what I've been writing in my publications. There was a particular candidate, Honda Ramarao. He belonged to a party called the Lok Satta Party in Andhra Pradesh. He actually went and in his expenditure statement, which is submitted to the returning officer, a bureaucrat who's nominated to that position by the Election Commission of India, in that expenditure statement, Mr. Ramarao said, I have paid a certain amount of money to a representative who claimed he was from India. Till then, they were not writing a single thing about me. And after I paid this money, they started writing nice things about me and what a good guy I was and so on and so forth. Then Mr. Ramarao said that I wanted him to give me a receipt so that it could be part of my official records, the expenditure statement. But that receipt never came. And the returning officer also said, in the absence of a receipt, how do you say that you got X amount of money from a particular person? And that matter is pending in court. But Mr. Ramarao was one of the few people who stood for elections who actually went on record, publicly acknowledged that he had paid money to a representative of a newspaper to have favorable articles about him published. The most celebrated case concerns the former Chief Minister of Maharashtra in Western India, which is one of India's most industrialized states. Now, he was Chief Minister for a relatively short period of time. But as P. Sainath published in the Hindu, there were 3 Marathi newspapers that were competing with each other that published articles about him, which were laudatory. The interesting thing was that all these articles came out with the same with same articles within a few days of each other. And every single word of the article was identical, from the first word to the last word, the picture, the headline. The only thing that was different in the 3 articles was the name of the writer, the name of the correspondent. The byline was different. So when we as members of the subcommittee of the Press Council went and asked Mr. Chauhan, how is this? He said, I have nothing to do with him, asked the publishers. I don't know whether they were lazy and they reprinted the press handout. This case went up to the Election Commission of India, and then from there to the High Court, and is currently in the Supreme Court of India as we talk. Now, given the clandestine nature of these transactions, it's very difficult to prove the transfer of money or that cash or things in kind exchange hands. And Mr. Chauhan is not just an important political personality, his lawyer is also an equally prominent political personality. He happens to be Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, who's a member of parliament, who's also a well-known lawyer. The third case was a more interesting one because the concerned person, she got caught. Her name was Mrs. Umlesh Yadav. Now what she put out these big advertisements in the newspaper. But her case, the newspapers were able to cover themselves. Why? They had a fig leaf of a disclaimer. Now you might need a a magnifying glass to read that small font size, but it was clearly written that what was printed were advertisements. There were four letters, A, D, V, T in small type. Everything else looked as if it was a news item. But all these laudatory articles about her carried a little disclaimer saying they were advertisements. So when the matter went up to the Press Council of India, they said, look, this is clear that you've been trying to disguise advertising and news. Did you disclose this expenditure? Because in this case, the concerned newspapers, the Dainik Jagran and the Amar Ujala, they said that, look, we've received money in check. We've said there's a disclaimer that this is an advertisement, so we are in the clear. Now, the Press Council of India, which is a quasi-judicial body set up by an act of parliament, it lacks teeth, it lacks punitive powers, it cannot punish anybody. So, the Press Council recommended that the Election Commission of India, take up the matter. And for the first time in the history of India, this was an unprecedented decision. The Election Commission, which was then headed by the Chief Election Commissioner, Dr. S.Y. Qureshi, actually passed a judgment, and Mrs. Umlesh Yadav was not just removed from a post as a member of the Legislative Assembly of Uttar Pradesh, but she was barred from contesting any elections for a 3-year period. So, for the first time, a sitting MLA had to resign, and she was disqualified and barred from contesting elections for a period of 3 years. And there's a little aside to this story, and this has got nothing to do with paid news. Mrs. Yadav, her husband is sometimes affectionately referred to as the Dawn of Ghaziabad by these dirty journalists. And her son, Vikas Yadav, he kind of spends his time, divides his time between Tihar jail and the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, because he's been convicted and jailed for two very high-profile murders, the murder of Jessica Lal and the murder of Nitish Kathar. As I said, this has got nothing to do with paid news. When we, in the Press Council of India, the subcommittee, we put together our report, that report was presented to the Council on the 1st of April 2010, All Fools Day. The then Chairman of the Press Council of India, Justice G.N. Ray, put together another committee to decide what should be finally given to the government. There was a heated debate, and finally the Council in its wisdom decided not to annex the full text of the report of the subcommittee that ran into 70,000, I beg your pardon, 30,000 words, 70 odd pages. What was instead sent to the government was a much shorter report, about a tenth of the size of the subcommittee's report, containing mainly the concluding observations and recommendations. But what had happened was, me and my colleague, when we had prepared our report and made some changes in it, we were asked to submit it. So we said, how do you want us to submit it? So we said, okay, shall we give it to you in a pen drive, in a hard disk, or a CD, or in a printed form? And we were told, oh, don't worry, just email it. So we emailed it, and before we knew it, there were 30 members of the Press Council. The two of us were members of the subcommittee, myself and Srinivas Reddy. And there was the then Chairman of the Press Council of India, Justice G.N. Ray, and the Secretary of the Press Council of India, Mrs. Vibha Bhargav. So besides the four of us, there were 26 other members, and they had all got email copies. Now, what happens when you have sort of 30 copies of a document circulating in cyberspace? There's a good chance that it will enter the public domain, which is precisely what happened. And it happened after the Council chose to give the short version of that report to the Government of India, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. It was 14 months later, roughly 14 months later, on account of Manu Mudgil, a journalist who works with the Hood.org among other places, he moved the Central Information Commission. And the Press Council didn't give that full report. You see that the details of that 70-page subcommittee's report entitled Paid News, How Corruption in the Indian Media Undermines Democracy, that document was not an official document. It had become a public document, but it was not an official document. It was not on the website of the Press Council of India. When Manu Mudgil petitioned the Information Commission. Central Information Commission naturally asked the press council, why haven't you put it up on your website? And all kinds of reasons were given, including so-called legal reasons, not specifying what these legal reasons were. Finally, the CIC gave an ultimatum to the press council of India and said, you have to put it up. And in October 2011, it appeared on the website of the Press Council of India. There it is. Any of you who are interested can access that full 70-page document running into over 30,000 words where we name names. Why did we name names? One, we wanted to shame these people. Secondly, we gave everybody the right to reply. The separate matter that some chose not to reply. Every allegation was substantiated, no anonymous allegations. Either individuals deposed before we who comprise the two members of the subcommittee, or send us letters or emails in writing. But one thing that one can say at the end of it all, that there is far greater awareness among different sections of Indian society about this particularly pernicious phenomenon called paid news, which undermines the very process of democracy, or the processes of democracy in India, the world's second most populous nation state, the world's largest democracy.